Welcome to Obscure Chronicle. We light a candle in the quiet and let its glow warm the dark. We stand at the edge of a city that once bustled with carriages and cobblestone. The air is damp and heavy with mist. Somewhere distant a bell tolls the hour, muffled by fog. We're not in a hurry. Our breath is a slow companion, like the tide. In this soft hour the world feels porous. Shadows slip through the streets, whispering stories not yet told. Tonight, we will follow one of those shadows, the final footsteps of Edgar Allan Poe. We do so gently, as if not to disturb the dust of 1849. Poe's name hovers like a raven over American letters, his tales of crypts and beating hearts, his poetry that aches with melancholy. Yet his death is a mystery that sits just beyond reach. On a wet October evening, he was found delirious on a Baltimore street, wearing someone else's clothes and muttering a name that has never been explained. 4 days later, his eyes closed forever, with no clear cause recorded. No one knows where he had been. No one knows what he had seen. No one knows whether he whispered secrets into the dark. We do not rush to solve this. The point of walking through the fog is not to see the horizon but to listen to the silence. We will wander through taverns and alleys, through letters and diaries, through the fevered imaginings of those who loved him and those who did not. We will hear the heartbeat of old Baltimore, with its taverns and polling places humming on election day. We will travel south to Richmond, where Poe reunited with a childhood sweetheart and spoke of a new beginning. We will feel the weight of his grief, the illnesses that clung to him like ghosts, the weight of a cane he borrowed from a doctor before boarding a steamer. The facts we have are few, the questions endless. Historians admit the truth may never be known. Perhaps that is why his final days call to us. In a world obsessed with answers, there is comfort in a story that refuses to be pinned down. Poe's own work dwelled in that space, between light and dark, sanity and madness, life and death. As we begin our journey, we remember that not everything must be solved to be remembered. We move slowly, like fog curling over riverbanks. We allow speculation to flicker like candlelight, illuminating possibilities without burning them away. In this calm exploration, we will meet a man who is at once familiar and strange. We will learn of doctors who warned him that another relapse could be fatal, of letters written with a trembling hand. We will overhear the rumours, Cooping gangs dragging men into taverns on election night, jealous rivals plotting murder. We will consider illnesses, brain fever, heart disease, perhaps even conditions unknown at the time. We will handle strands of his hair, tested for arsenic and lead, and find traces but no poison. Each clue is like a feather on the scale, never tipping it fully. So take a breath with us. Let your mind soften. The floorboards creak, the candle gutter. Outside, the city of 1849 fades in and out of focus. Poe's life was full of mystery, his death more so. Perhaps in tracing the whispers of his last days, we will find not a solution, but a quiet understanding of how stories linger when facts fall away. And perhaps that's all he ever wanted, to disappear. Quietly, his name drifting into the fog. We begin not with a mystery but with a boy who bore the weight of absence. Edgar Poe entered the world in Boston in 1809 to act as Eliza and David Poe. His father vanished when he was a year old. His mother died of tuberculosis when he was scarcely 2. An orphan, Edgar was taken in by the Richmond merchant John Allen and his wife Frances. They gave him their name, but not crucially an adoption. As he grew, he sensed he lived between families, loved by Francis, tolerated by John, never quite fitting the role of heir. Biographers note that tensions with Allan simmered for years, a dissonance that would later echo in Poe's stories of unreliable guardians and false homes. Young Edgar was bright and precocious. He attended private schools in Richmond and even served in the honour guard that escorted the Marquis de Lafayette through the city in 1824. At 17, he enrolled at the new University of Virginia. The university, founded by Thomas Jefferson, was an experiment in secular education and self-governance. Students chose their classes and governed themselves, an arrangement ripe for mischief. Poe thrived on poetry and language, but he lacked funds. Allan sent him with barely enough for tuition. Poe turned to gambling to supplement his needs. Debts mounted. When his foster father refused further support, Edgar dropped out and returned to Richmond to find his sweetheart, Elmira Royster, engaged to another man. Elmira's father had intercepted Poe's letters and steered her toward a wealthier suitor, inaugurating a pattern in Poe's life: letters lost, affections thwarted. Young Edgar was bright and precocious. He attended private schools in Richmond and even served in the honour guard that escorted the Marquis de Lafayette through the city in 1824. At 17, he enrolled at the new University of Virginia. The university, founded by Thomas Jefferson, was an experiment in secular education and self-governance. Students chose their classes and governed themselves, an arrangement ripe for mischief. Poe thrived on poetry and language, but he lacked funds. Allan sent him with barely enough for tuition. Poe turned to gambling to supplement his needs. Debts mounted. When his foster father refused further support, Edgar dropped out and returned to Richmond to find his sweetheart, Elmira Royster, engaged to another man. Elmira's father had intercepted Poe's letters and steered her toward a wealthier suitor, inaugurating a pattern in Poe's life: letters lost, affections thwarted. Out of options, Poe fled. In 1827, he published a small volume, Tamerlane and Other Poems, anonymously, and enlisted in the US Army under the alias Edgar Perry. He embraced the military's discipline, rising quickly to sergeant major. Yet his dreams were literary, not martial. Allan helped secure his release so he could attend West Point, but their reconciliation was brittle. At the academy, Poe chafed. He amassed demerits deliberately, seeking expulsion. In 1831, he was court-martialed for dereliction of duty and dismissed. His time at West Point gave him an enduring love of cryptography and ciphers. Military puzzles he later bent into literary riddles. Penniless and free, Poe lodged with his aunt Maria Clem and her young daughter Virginia in Baltimore. There he shifted from poetry to prose. In 1833, his story, MS Found in a Bottle, won a $50 prize and caught the eye of editors. He joined the staff of the Southern Literary Messenger in Richmond, and for a time his sharp criticism and fertile imagination boosted the magazine's circulation. His reviews were acid and precise. He wrote tales of horror, science fiction, and detection. He used the magazine to champion a principle of unity in short stories that would influence writers long after him. Yet his temper and bouts of drinking alienated his employer, Thomas White. He was dismissed in 1837. During these years, Poe's personal life took a strange turn that hints at his capacity for both tenderness and taboo. In 1836, he married Virginia Clem. She was 13, he was 27. The marriage was affectionate. He called her Sissy and her mother Muddy. and their household offered Poe a rare period of stability. Critics have long debated the nature of their bond. What is clear is that Virginia's presence soothed him and gave his nomadic life a centre. Between 1838 and 1844, Poe lived in Philadelphia and New York, writing the stories that secured his reputation. He produced The Fall of the House of Usher, The Telltale Heart, The Black Cat, and The Masque of the Red Death. In 1841, he introduced The Murders in the Rue Morgue, a tale featuring C. Auguste Dupin, the first fictional detective. Dupin's analytic reasoning anticipated Sherlock Holmes. The story inaugurated the modern detective genre. Poe also published The Gold Bug, in which a cipher leads to buried treasure. In the context of his biography, the story reveals Poe's fascination with cryptography. The coded message is cracked by analysing letter frequencies, a method Poe championed in his 1841 essay, A Few Words on Secret Writing. In that essay, he asserted that no cipher is unbreakable and urged academies to use cryptography to sharpen students' analytic abilities. He sketched the history of secret writing, from Spartan Sistala to shifting alphabets, and insisted that human ingenuity could always resolve human-devised codes. Poe practiced what he preached. He invited magazine readers to send him ciphers and publicly solved nearly all of them. When one stumped him, it remained unsolved until a software expert cracked it in 2000. For Poe, cryptography was not merely a parlour game. It was a metaphor for the mind's ability to penetrate obfuscation. Later scholars note that he sometimes embedded acrostics and steganographic puzzles in his poems, hinting that his fascination with hidden meanings extended into his art. Poe's engagement with science went beyond codes. Throughout his life, he was both enamoured with and wary of scientific progress. In his youth, he wrote a sonnet that chided science as a vulture preying upon the poet's heart. Yet by the 1840s, he devoured contemporary works by Sir John Herschel and Alexander von Humboldt. He exposed scientific frauds in the press and perpetrated them himself. For example, his 1844 balloon hoax convinced New Yorkers that a transatlantic airship had landed in Manhattan. This ambivalence culminated in his final completed work, Eureka, a Prose Poem, 1848. Presented first as a lecture and later published as a book, Eureka attempted nothing less than a theory of the universe. Scholars have called it a synthesis of Poe's scientific knowledge, poetic power, and metaphysical speculation. Poe argued that because gravity acts between every particle, the universe must have originated from a single point. Because nothing was, therefore all things are. He treated gravity as the reaction to the divine act of creation, and predicted that the universe would eventually collapse back into unity. He dedicated the work to Humboldt and drew on contemporary theories by Laplace and Newton, while infusing them with intuition. Critics dismissed the book as madness, yet modern scientists note that Poe anticipated ideas resembling the Big Bang and the oscillating universe. The Paris Review later described Eureka as a cosmological treatise that oscillates between prose poem, polemic, and scientific report. Poe declared that its truths were arrived at through mere dint of intuition, a claim that scandalized empiricists but underscored his belief in the poet as seer. The interplay between art and analysis also informs his interest in cryptography. The Baltimore Post-Examiner notes that secret writing was common in the 19th century for lovers and businessmen. Poe recognized its cultural resonance. His essays on ciphers explained systems using key phrases and shifting alphabets. He demonstrated how the Latin phrase suaviter in modo, fortiter in re could encode entire alphabets. In a poem written for Sarah Anna Lewis, he hid her name in the acrostic, showing his playful mastery of steganography. Some scholars speculate that Eureka itself contains hidden messages. The Post-Examiner suggests that Poe's odd sentence constructions and his insistence that the book be judged as a poem hint at steganographic layers. Whether or not these codes exist, the suggestion reveals how deeply readers associate Poe with puzzles and secrets. In his famous detective stories, the solution often hinges on the discovery of a concealed clue. In his life, the clues lead only to more enigma. While his mind roamed the cosmos, Poe's body and heart suffered. Virginia contracted tuberculosis and died in 1847 at age 24. Witnesses recall Poe kneeling by her bed, weeping and pleading with God. After her death, his drinking increased and his mood darkened. He wrote the haunting poem Ulalume and the elegy Annabel Lee, memorials to lost love. Without Virginia, his household dissolved. He moved between cities, lecturing and editing. He found solace in the home of the Richmond writer Susan Archer Talley Weiss, who later recalled that doctors warned him another bout of illness could be fatal. His health declined further after he suffered cholera in the summer of 1849, leaving him weak and trembling. Yet he remained ambitious. He planned to launch a new magazine, The Stylus, and to marry his first love, Elmira Royster Shelton. In June 1849, he embarked on a lecture tour to raise funds, travelling from New York to Philadelphia, Richmond, and Norfolk. In Richmond, he reunited with Elmira, and they renewed their engagement. On September 27th, he left the city carrying a cane he had mistakenly swapped with Dr. James Carter. Elmira remembered him sober and cheerful. What he carried with him, subscriptions, letters, perhaps his manuscript for Eureka, would never be found. 4 days later, he was discovered delirious in Baltimore, wearing someone else's clothes. His final journey belongs to the next chapter. Poe's life, like his fiction, weaves brilliance with sorrow. He invented genres and solved puzzles. He courted science and mocked it. He loved deeply and lost profoundly. An orphan who craved belonging, he found a family in literature. His tragedies fueled his imagination. His restlessness drove him to experiment with forms. The first chapter of his story ends with an image both mundane and poignant. A man boarding a steamer on the James River, carrying a borrowed cane and clutching hopes for a magazine and a new marriage. The fog of the river thickens. On the far shore, possibilities glow like candles. Behind him, the graves of parents, wife and foster mother recede into darkness. Ahead lies the mystery that will outlive him. We pull our chairs closer to the fire and lower our voices. The storm outside has quieted. Only the steady drip from the eaves keeps time. It is here, in the lull between chapters, that we look beyond Poe's imagination and into his flesh. Before he disappeared into fog and rumour, his body began to falter. What illnesses clung to him? What warnings whispered in doctors' rooms and letters? We listen as though pressing our ear to a door, catching fragments of conversation and the rustle of paper. In the summer of 1849, disease stalked the streets of American cities. In New York, a cholera epidemic sent 100,000 people fleeing. In Philadelphia, physicians tried opium, mercury and tobacco smoke in vain. Poe was caught in this panic. On July 7th, he wrote to his mother-in-law, Maria Clem, "I have been so ill, have had the cholera or spasms quite as bad, and can now hardly hold the pen. The very instant you get this, come to me. The joy of seeing you will almost compensate for our sorrows. We can but die together. It is no use to reason with me now. I must die. He had written New York at the top of the page, but scholars suspect he was in Philadelphia when he penned those words. His letter is not only a plea, it is a portrait of a man weak enough to believe death was imminent. 12 days later he wrote again, saying he had barely escaped with my life. In early August he told a friend that the worst consequences were not the cholera itself, but the lingering debility and congestion of the brain, which he attributed to calomel, a mercury-based remedy. He was living in a world that treated illness with toxins. The remedies that promised relief may have poisoned him. Those weeks of sickness were not Poe's first encounter with physical frailty. 2 years earlier, Dr. Valentine Mott, a renowned New York physician, examined him and agreed with nurse Marie-Louise Shue that Poe had lesions on the brain. Another doctor, John W. Francis, diagnosed heart disease, which Poe vehemently denied. Susan Archer, Tally Weiss, remembered seeing him after an illness in Richmond. He appeared so pale, so tremulous, and apparently subdued as to convince me that he had been seriously ill. In her account, he'd been tended at the Old Swan Tavern by the Mackenzie family, and then, during a more serious relapse, taken by Dr. Mackenzie and Dr. William Gibbon Carter to Duncan's Lodge. His life hung in the balance for days. When he recovered, the physicians warned him that another attack would be fatal. He replied, "If people would not tempt me, I would not fall." The remark reveals his awareness that his illnesses were intertwined with his drinking. He knew his constitution could not bear another spree. Poe's body also carried scars of unknown origin. Nurse Shue later recalled a wound on his left shoulder near the heart and a head injury. She asked if he'd been hurt. He affirmed and said nothing more. One wonders whether these injuries were the result of accidents, duels, or assaults. They may have contributed to his persistent headaches and what contemporaries called brain fever. In an era before neurology, people used that term to describe seizures, delirium, and other symptoms we would now attribute to different conditions. Medical speculation has proliferated around his death. Some modern writers suggest he had an alcohol dehydrogenase deficiency, an enzyme disorder that would make him extraordinarily sensitive to alcohol. The theory attempts to reconcile his occasional binges with the fact that he was not a habitual drunkard. Others propose he suffered from tuberculosis, epilepsy, diabetes, or even rabies. In 1996, a doctor hypothesized that Poe died of rabies, citing accounts that he had difficulty swallowing. But later investigation showed that he was able to drink water and ice without trouble, undermining the rabies case. Hair tests performed in 2002 revealed elevated arsenic and lead levels, but not enough to indicate poisoning. Mercury exposure from calomel was present but far below toxic levels. Coal gas exposure tests were inconclusive, making carbon monoxide poisoning unlikely. Each theory flickers and fades like candlelight, illuminating some facets and leaving others in shadow. Another curious episode surfaced when his body was moved in 1875 to a more prominent grave. Newspapers reported that his brain appeared preserved, shrunken and hardened within his skull. Matthew Pearl, a novelist and researcher, argued in 2007 that this mass was a calcified brain tumour, a growth that might have caused hallucinations and delusions. A forensic pathologist told Pearl that certain tumours can calcify and resemble a brain after death. If true, such a tumour could explain some of Poe's later symptoms. Yet the evidence is tenuous, resting on 19th century newspaper reports and the assumption that a tumour would remain intact after decomposition. Like other conjectures, the tumour theory invites us to imagine but not to know. The list of illnesses considered by biographers reads like a catalogue of Victorian maladies. Dr. John C. S. Munker thought Poe would die from nervous prostration due to exposure, affecting the brain's delicate membranes. The cholera letter shows him nearly unable to hold a pen. Diary entries from July 1849 record him writing under more favourable circumstances, relieved to find his handwriting steadier. These shifts suggest a man whose condition waxed and waned, perhaps due to chronic illness. Poe's precarious health may also have been exacerbated by the era's harsh treatments. Physicians prescribed calomel, opium, mercury pills, and even tobacco smoke enemas for cholera. Each remedy could debilitate as much as heal. When he wrote of congestion of the brain after the cholera attack, he implicitly blamed the medicine, not the disease. Against this backdrop of speculation, a new theory surfaced in 2024 that reframed Poe's symptoms entirely. Joe Nickell, writing in Skeptical Inquirer, proposed that Poe suffered from Parkinson's disease or a related Parkinsonism. Parkinsonism, he notes, arises when brain cells producing dopamine deteriorate, leading to slow movement, tremors, facial rigidity, and peculiar gait. Variations are numerous. Symptoms can include hallucinations. Nickell points out that in earlier times Parkinson's-related hallucinations were not well understood. Poe's visions of shadowy killers, his conviction that men were plotting to murder him, and his repeated cry of Reynolds could be the result of internal rather than external threats. His tremors and stiffness, witnessed by friends, might have been mistaken for delirium tremens. Even falls or staggering episodes previously attributed to drunkenness or assault could have been caused by the disease. The theory is compelling not because it solves the mystery definitively, but because it humanizes him. It suggests that his final years were not simply a decline into drink, but a struggle against a degenerative illness that he could neither name nor understand. It invites us to replace disparagement with empathy. Still, as Nickell himself acknowledges, retrospective diagnosis is speculative. Parkinson's does not exclude other factors. A man can have a tumour and still be beaten, or have Parkinson's and still be robbed. Throughout these speculations, what remains clear is that Poe was repeatedly warned. Doctors told him his constitution was fragile. Friends saw him pale and tremulous. His own letters testify to debilitating spasms and brain congestion. He survived an illness at Duncan's lodge only to be told that another attack would kill him. He responded with defiance tempered by resignation. If others would not tempt him, he would not fall. This comment reveals his recognition that he was vulnerable not only to disease but to social pressures. Alcohol, for him, was a double-edged tool. He used a sip to steady his nerves before a lecture. A glass of sherry could send him into a spree. Some friends believed he needed stimulants to talk well in company, and that occasional drinking bouts were misinterpreted as constant drunkenness. Yet those bouts might have triggered or worsened his medical conditions. The line between self-medication and self-destruction blurred. This chapter is about his body, but it is also about his awareness of that body. Imagine him at a tavern table, writing to Maria with a hand that shakes. The ink spreads unevenly across the paper. Imagine him turning to Dr. Carter after being told he may die and saying quietly that he would avoid temptation if people would let him. These are not scenes of gothic horror, but of human frailty. He lived in an era when cholera struck without warning, when medicine was as much alchemy as science, when brain lesions were diagnosed by looking to face, and when mental illness was moralized as weakness. Poe felt each of these currents. His letters reveal a man who feared death yet yearned for relief. His conversations reveal a man who recognized his vulnerabilities yet bristled at admonitions. As we sit with him in that room at Duncan's lodge, we can almost hear the creak of the floorboards and the whisper of doctors conferring. Outside, the leaves of late September rustle. Poe's cane, the one he borrowed by mistake from Doctor. Carter rests by the bed. He is not yet embarked on the journey that will end in Baltimore, but the warnings are there. His health is a character in this story, moody, unpredictable, central. Before we follow him out into the night, we linger over these ailments because they form the landscape through which he walks. In the next chapter, he will set out toward a city buzzing with election fever, carrying within him the aftermath of cholera, the scars of past injuries, the tremor of a disease unnamed. The fog that will soon swallow him is not just literal. It is the haze of sickness, of speculation, of incomplete knowledge. We move forward slowly, aware that every footstep carries the weight of his body's frailty. On a summer morning in 1849, with the Atlantic wind still warm, Poe stepped onto a train and began what he hoped would be his last campaign against poverty. He was 40, living in the cottage in Fordham with his mother-in-law Maria Clem. His magazine dream, the stylus, was still an idea on paper. The little cottage, with its honeysuckle and modest parlour, was full of memories of Virginia's suffering and death. Poe needed money, and he needed a change. So he did what he had often done when publishers' doors closed. He took to the lecture circuit. On June 29th, he set out on a southern tour to raise funds and subscribers. He travelled first to Philadelphia, then to Richmond and Norfolk, speaking on the poetic principle. At Richmond's Exchange Concert Room on August 17th, he was greeted by a large audience. He later told Maria that he had never been received with so much enthusiasm. Those who attended remembered his voice as clear and musical, almost hypnotic. Another writer noted that there was little variation and much sadness in the intonations of his voice, a sadness that seemed to echo the tragedies of his life. He repeated the lecture in Norfolk on September 14th and delivered his last public performance at Richmond's Exchange Hotel on September the 24th. 25 years later, one attendee recalled that the melancholy cadence of Poe's reading excited deep interest and sympathy in the audience. Yet behind the applause lay urgency. He needed the proceeds to finance a journal and to start anew. Richmond was not just another stop on the circuit. It was the city of his youth, the place where he had first courted Elmira Royster when they were teenagers. Elmira, now Mrs. Shelton, was recently widowed. When Poe arrived in July, he sought her out at her home on East Main Street. Decades had passed since he last held her hand. Their youthful engagement had been sabotaged by intercepted letters. Elmira's father hid Poe's letters and led her to marry another. Now, free of her husband, Elmira received Poe at her parlour. They shared memories of childhood and grief. According to the Poe Society, both were widowed, and after a brief courtship they renewed their long-ago engagement. Letters exchanged during the summer carry a tenderness and a practicality. Poe asked Elmira to send subscriptions for the stylus. She expressed concern for his health. On August 27th, he joined the Shockoe Hill division of the Sons of Temperance, pledging total abstinence. For a man whose reputation was tethered to alcohol, this was a striking gesture. Friends noted that he was earnest in his reform. He wanted to present Elmira not with a poet who drank, but with a sober husband. By September 26th, with lecture receipts in his pocket, an engagement ring on Elmira's finger, and promises of a new magazine, Poe told her he would return to New York to fetch Maria Clem and move their belongings to Richmond. Elmira later wrote that he seemed unwell, perhaps feverish, and she thought he should not travel, but he insisted. He spoke of his responsibilities to his mother-in-law, his subscribers, his reputation. The wedding would wait until he came back. On the evening of September 27th, Poe made his final rounds in Richmond. He dined at the Swan Tavern and collected his baggage. Around 9:30 he stopped at the office of Dr. John F. Carter at 7th and Broad Streets. Carter later recalled that the poet looked over some papers and amused himself with Carter's Malacca walking stick, a handsome cane that unscrewed to reveal a sword. They talked for a while, about lectures, perhaps about Elmira, until Poe declared that he was going to Sadler's, the restaurant across the street, for supper. He left absent-mindedly with Carter's cane under his arm, leaving behind his own cane and a copy of Moore's Irish Melodies. This substitution would later assume symbolic weight. He unknowingly carried a hidden weapon. At Sadler's he met acquaintances who detained him late into the night. According to Susan Weiss, who collected accounts of his last days, these friends accompanied him to the Baltimore boat. They said he was quite sober and cheerful to the last, remarking as he took leave that he would soon be in Richmond again. Another report by Elmira herself contended that he was sick, and she doubted he should travel, illustrating how even those closest to him could not agree on his condition. There is poignancy in that small circle of light. Poe, the cane with its hidden sword, the warm plates at Sadler's, friends lingering as the hour grows late. At midnight he left the restaurant. The steamer to Baltimore, likely the Pocahontas, was scheduled to depart at 4 a.m. Whether Poe slept at all is unclear. Sadler later told Dr. Carter that Poe seemed in good spirits, but left his baggage at the Swan Tavern. Carter waited with mounting irritation for the return of his cane, unaware that his friend had already gone. At dawn on September 28th, the ship slipped down the James River toward the Chesapeake Bay. Fog hung over the water. Passengers remember nothing special about the voyage. Somewhere on deck or below, Poe stood alone, clutching a walking stick that was not his, carrying letters and perhaps subscription money. Bishop Fitzgerald later claimed that Poe had $1,500 in subscription funds. If true, it would make him a tempting target, but most scholars consider this figure exaggerated. Another friend advanced him a small sum for an article. Whether he travelled with a fortune or merely a few dollars, he left Richmond with hope. From here the path becomes faint. The boat docked in Baltimore on the morning of September 28th. Nielsen Poe, his cousin, later wrote that he could not discover where Edgar spent the next days or under what circumstances. Some accounts say he visited Dr. Nathan Covington Brooks, but Brooks was out of town. Others propose he travelled on to Philadelphia. On September 18th, 10 days before leaving Richmond, Poe had written to Maria Clem, "On Tuesday I start for Philadelphia to attend to Mrs. Loud's poems, and possibly on Thursday I may start for New York. If I do, I will go straight over to Mrs. Lewis's and send for you. It will be better for me not to go to Fordham, don't you think so? Write immediately, for fear I should not get the letter. Sign no name and address it to E.S.T. Gray, Esquire." The pseudonym E.S.T. Gray and his insistence on anonymity hint at secrecy. Perhaps he feared his letters would be intercepted as his courtship letters once were. Some later said he did indeed go to Philadelphia to edit Mrs. Leon Loud's poetry and became ill there. They claimed he took the wrong train back and ended up in Baltimore by mistake. Modern scholars doubt this story, noting that similar events occurred in 1848, not 1849, and that bad weather would have made travel to Philadelphia difficult. It remains possible he tried and failed. What is certain is that he told Maria to write to him in Philadelphia and to sign no name, a detail that adds to the sense of covert movement. His request that she not go to Fordham suggests he wished to avoid his old cottage. Why? Had he quarrelled with its landlord? Did he fear creditors? Or did he simply want to spare her the melancholy of the place where Virginia died? The hours between September 28th and October 3rd are a blank page. Did he walk Baltimore's streets, seeking a friend? Did he sit in a tavern, nursing his trembling hands? Did he board a train to Philadelphia and then return? The speculation is relentless. One theory suggests that he was robbed and beaten because he carried subscription funds. Another imagines him drawn into an election day cooping gang, forced to vote multiple times. We will explore this later. A different rumour has him drinking with old army comrades and collapsing into delirium. None can be proved. Nielsen Poe wrote to Maria Clem on October 11th that he could not ascertain where Edgar spent his time. It is as if he stepped off the boat and walked into fog. For 4 days he was invisible. Then on October 3rd, a typesetter found him outside Ryan's 4th Ward polling place, barely conscious and wearing someone else's clothing, a moment we will return to in the next chapter. For now, we linger on that last clear night in Richmond. The lamplight gleams on polished wood, on the brass tip of Carter's cane. Elmira stands at her window, perhaps watching the boat lights on the river. In Poe's pocket is a letter instructing Maria to address him as E.S.T. Gray. In his mind swirl fragments of lectures, images of Elmira in her parlour, the dream of a magazine. The James River flows steady and dark, carrying him toward the Chesapeake and into the unknown. The stage on which he had charmed an audience days before is dark now. The voice that filled it is quiet. He is no longer the lecturer, but a traveller, a fiancé, a son-in-law, a poet between engagements and between cities. In his hand is a cane he meant to return. Each step from Dr. Carter's office, each mile downriver, increases the distance between his promises and his fate. The final tour ends not with applause but with a question. The mist that closed behind the steamer seemed to swallow more than the wake. When Poe stepped off the boat in Baltimore on September 28th, 1849, he entered a space that historians call the Lost Days. He had planned a simple itinerary, travel from Richmond to New York by steamer, stopping briefly to see friends in Baltimore or Philadelphia. Yet once he disembarked, the record dissolves. Even his cousin Nielsen Poe wrote to Maria Clem that he could not discover where Edgar spent the next days or under what circumstances. The National Park Service notes bluntly that his actions and whereabouts during the 5 days after his arrival are uncertain, a gap that invites speculation as if it were a blank page in one of his tales. Baltimore in early October was noisy and vibrant. Election day approached. Taverns doubled as polling stations. Voters were plied with whiskey and beer. Poe, pale from illness but buoyed by new plans, stepped into this atmosphere with only a few dollars and a cane that was not his own. Some accounts claim he carried up to $1,500 in subscription money for his proposed magazine, but this would have required 300 subscribers on a single trip more than he had ever collected. A more believable story is that John R. Thompson advanced him a small sum for an article. Whatever funds he had, no money was found when he was discovered. On September 18th, he had written to Maria Clem that he planned to go to Philadelphia to edit Mrs. Leon Loud's poems and might head directly to New York from there. He instructed her to write to Fila, using the pseudonym E.S.T. Gray, and to sign no name. Why he sought such secrecy is unclear. Was he avoiding creditors? Did he fear intercepting eyes as he once did when courting Elmira? His letter hints at a man moving through the world like a cipher, careful not to leave traces. Speculation about these days is as varied as Poe's stories. One tradition claims he attended a friend's birthday party and, despite his temperance pledge, joined in a toast. Another places him in a social club at 1 AAA Alley, kept by Mary Nelson, where he gave a 16-year-old girl nicknamed Lenore a brotherly kiss and urged her to reform. Such tales, recorded decades later, read like gossip and may be apocryphal. Others suggest he took a train to Philadelphia to meet Mrs. Loud, became ill there, and boarded the wrong train back to Baltimore. Biographer T.O. Mabbott believed the story belonged to 1848, not 1849. Moran, Poe's final physician, later claimed bad weather prevented the Philadelphia trip. The only evidence that he intended such a journey is the letter to Maria. Whether he attempted it remains unknown. Some historians imagine him roaming Baltimore's streets, vulnerable to thieves because he carried subscription money. Others picture him in taverns, succumbing to old temptations. None of these possibilities is supported by contemporary records. They float like lanterns over dark water. Modern writers have returned again and again to the so-called Cooping theory. Because Poe was found on October 3rd at a polling place, Ryan's Fourth Ward polls, one line of speculation suggests he was kidnapped by election gangs, forced to drink or drugged, disguised and made to vote repeatedly. Cooping was a known practice. Voters were coerced into multiple ballots by threats or bribes. It explains the change of clothing and his delirious state. Yet there is no direct evidence he was a victim. He was not the anonymous labourer such gangs targeted. He was a recognisable writer visiting a city where he had relatives. Other theories propose that he was beaten and robbed. Bishop Fitzgerald's claim that he carried large sums makes robbery plausible, but the figure itself is doubtful. There is also the persistent suggestion that he simply drank himself into stupor. He had pledged temperance in August, but he had broken pledges before. People's recollections of his sobriety or drunkenness often mirrored their beliefs about temperance. The truth of these days may incorporate elements from all theories, small drinks turning into a binge, a lost purse, a blow to the head, but the pattern remains obscured. As the National Park Service points out, none of these theories explains his clothing or offers clear evidence. At midday on October 3rd, the fog of speculation lifts briefly. A printer named Joseph W. Walker wrote a hasty note to Dr. Joseph Snodgrass. There is a gentleman, rather the worse for wear, at Ryan's Fourth Ward polls, who goes under the cognomen of Edgar A. Poe and who appears in great distress, and he says he is acquainted with you, and I assure you he is in need of immediate assistance. Walker found Poe either in the street outside or in the tavern itself. Gunner's Hall, as it was also known, was a tavern buzzing with voters and the smell of spilled ale. When Snodgrass and Poe's uncle Henry Herring arrived, they found the poet nearly unconscious. Snodgrass recalled that his clothing was threadbare and ill-fitting. A stained, faded gabardine coat, worn-out shoes, and an old straw hat. He wore no vest or neckcloth, and the bosom of his shirt was crumpled and soiled. Snodgrass and Herring, presuming him drunk, decided he should be taken to Washington College Hospital. According to some accounts, Poe still held Doctor, Carter's cane, His own trunk remained at the Swan Tavern in Richmond. The key may have been in his pocket. The clothing change suggests he had been robbed or swapped clothes with someone. The cane with its hidden sword returned to Richmond after his death, an eerie relic of his last clear hours. At the hospital, Poe drifted between worlds. The physician in charge, Dr. John J. Moran, later wrote that Poe's answers to questions about his condition were incoherent and unsatisfactory. He allowed no visitors because the patient was too excitable. Nielsen Poe was turned away when he called on October 4th. Moran's letter to Maria Clem, considered the most reliable account despite its inconsistencies, describes periods when Poe held vacant converse with spectral and imaginary objects on the walls. He experienced tremors, unconsciousness and delirium, and he was unable to recall where he had been or how he became ill. On the evening before his death, he repeatedly called out the name Reynolds. Later speculation produced a list of possible Reynolds: Henry R. Reynolds, a judge and friend; Jeremiah N. Reynolds, an adventurer; the family of his Baltimore cousin; even the writer of the note who found him, but none fits securely. One scholar suggested he might have been calling Herring, his uncle's name, misheard by the doctor. The cry remains as ambiguous as his own tales. According to Moran, sometime between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m. on October the 7th, 1849, he whispered, "Lord help my poor soul," and died. The cause was listed in the newspaper as congestion of the brain, and no death certificate was filed. The 2025 University of Maryland article notes that medical records have never been found. In an era without autopsies for such cases, his death certificate is lost, leaving only the doctor's contested narratives. The days after his death have their own haze. His body lay in the hospital rotunda and, according to Moran, was visited by some of Baltimore's first citizens, eager for a lock of his hair. He was buried on October 8th or 9th in his grandfather's lot at the Westminster Burying Ground, in a simple ceremony attended by a handful of relatives and friends. Rain sprinkled the cold, grey afternoon. Within hours, speculation about his final days had begun. Newspapers whispered that he died of brain congestion. Temperance lecturers claimed he died from drink. Family members insisted he was sober and had been beaten. The man who wrote the first modern detective story had become the subject of one. A century and 3/4 later, the lost days still resist illumination. Historians and doctors have pored over letters, hospital records and weather reports. Novelists have imagined conspiracies. Forensic tests have measured heavy metals in strands of his hair. Yet none can fill the blank between September 28th and October 3rd. We are left with glimpses, a letter written in a shaky hand advising Maria to write to E.S.T. Gray, a memory of a party toast, an anecdote about a social club, a scrap of paper from a printer begging assistance, a doctor's letter describing spectral conversations, a final plea for divine mercy. The connections between these points are conjecture. This gap mirrors the spaces in Poe's fiction where the narrator faints or the text breaks off mid-sentence, leaving readers to imagine what happened. In tracing his disappearance, we confront not just the limits of documentation, but the allure of uncertainty. Poe's life had been marked by secrets and codes. His death is itself a cipher. Its missing pieces invite the same careful reading and imaginative speculation that his stories demand. As we move to the next chapter, which explores the moment of his discovery at Gunner's Hall and the theories that sprang up in its aftermath, we carry with us the understanding that some mysteries are sustained by absence as much as by evidence. Baltimore woke to a grey, damp morning on October 3rd, 1849. The city hummed with Election Day anticipation. Taverns doubled as polling stations, and voters were rewarded with drinks for casting ballots. In the warren of narrow streets east of the harbour stood Gunners Hall, also called Ryan's Fourth Ward Polls, an Irish pub with a bar room crowded by men whose voices rose and fell with the tide of the vote. Outside, the cobblestones were slick with last night's rain. Around midday, a printer named Joseph Walker noticed a man slumped on the sidewalk or leaning in the doorway, so dishevelled and incoherent that Walker had to lean close to catch his name. It was Edgar Allan Poe. Walker penned a note and sent it by messenger to Dr. Joseph Evans Snodgrass, a physician and former editor who had published some of Poe's stories. "There is a gentleman, rather the worse for wear, at Ryan's Fourth Ward Polls," he wrote, "who goes under the cognomen of Edgar A. Poe, and who appears in great distress, and he says he is acquainted with you, and I assure you he is in need of immediate assistance." The note reached Snodgrass at home. He would later recall that he recognized the handwriting because Walker had once set type for him and knew of his interest in Poe. Snodgrass hurried to the tavern with Poe's uncle Henry Herring. They found a crowd of men gathered around an armchair. In it sat the author of The Raven, unrecognizable. His face was haggard and unwashed, his hair unkempt. A rusty straw hat shaded dull eyes that had once glinted with mischief. His clothing, a thin, ripped alpaca coat and badly fitting pants of steel-mix cassinet, was cheap and soiled. He wore no vest or neckcloth. On his feet were boots of coarse material, unpolished and run down at the heels. Even Snodgrass, who had known Poe for years, barely recognized him. Snodgrass later wrote that he initially ordered a private room at the tavern where Poe might recover. As he arranged this, Herring intercepted him on the stairs and argued that Poe should be taken to a hospital, explaining that he could not bring his nephew to his own home because Poe had previously behaved rudely toward the women of the household while drunk. Snodgrass agreed. They called a carriage. When they tried to lift Poe to his feet, he could not stand. He muttered oaths and imprecations as they carried him as if he were already a corpse. In the carriage, according to Snodgrass, Poe was barely conscious. His head lolled forward, and he seemed incapable of speech. Snodgrass and Herring directed the driver to Washington College Hospital, recently renamed Baltimore City and Marine Hospital. The hospital, located on Broadway Street, had opened a new building in 1839 that housed both lecture rooms and wards for 50 patients. Poe would die there 4 days later. The scene at Gunners Hall has become the pivot on which theories turn. Some accounts, like the National Park Service's, emphasized that the tavern was a polling place where voters were plied with liquor. This detail lends weight to the Cooping theory, in which election gangs kidnapped men, drugged or forced them to drink, disguised them, and made them cast multiple ballots. If Poe was cooped, the change of clothing and his delirious condition fit. Yet the theory has no direct evidence. Others, like the 2025 University of Maryland article, list beating, mugging, or voluntary binge drinking as possibilities. Each explanation echoes in the barroom air. Perhaps he'd been robbed of his black suit and forced into someone else's clothes. Perhaps he'd succumbed to his weakness for drink. Perhaps he'd been targeted for his subscription money. Perhaps he'd simply fallen and struck his head. Witnesses at the tavern left no record. Snodgrass's account, written 18 years later, describes a man in beastly intoxication and evident destitution. He said he recognized the smell of liquor on Poe and insisted he was so altered from the neat, vivacious gentleman he had once been that he would not have known him without Walker's note. This version would shape Poe's reputation for decades. But modern biographers note that Snodgrass was a temperance advocate and that his fervour coloured his statements. He repeated the claim of drunkenness in lectures and articles used to promote abstinence. He even manipulated evidence in ways that later discredited him as a reliable source. In his zeal, he turned Poe into a cautionary tale and drowned more nuanced explanations in moral rhetoric. Dr. Moran, Poe's attending physician, disputed Snodgrass's account. He claimed there was no smell of liquor on Poe and insisted he did not die under the effect of an intoxicant. In an 1885 defence, he wrote that Poe had not the slightest odour of liquor upon his breath or person. Moran's credibility is itself suspect. His stories changed over time, and he seemed to embellish details to boost his fame. Still, his statement complicates the narrative. Contemporary newspaper notices simply listed congestion of the brain, or cerebral inflammation, euphemisms often used for deaths caused by alcohol. J.P. Kennedy, an acquaintance, wrote in his diary that Poe died from the effects of a debauch, noting that he fell in with companions who seduced him to the bottle. Kennedy admitted he was repeating second-hand information, likely from Snodgrass. The rumour spread because it served temperance lecturers and sensational journalism. It also fit the Victorian penchant for moralising tragedy. In the immediate aftermath, Snodgrass's moralising voice drowned out other witnesses. He wrote for the Women's Temperance paper and for Beadle's Monthly. He toured the country preaching about the dangers of drink. His description of Poe's besotted condition and voiceless muttering was reprinted widely, accompanied by warnings about alcohol. The image stuck. It inspired obituaries that painted Poe as a victim of his own excess, and gave ammunition to his literary executor Rufus Griswold, who portrayed him as depraved and drunken. Yet those who were with Poe in Richmond just a week earlier remembered a different man. Pale, yes, but sober and cheerful. He had joined the Sons of Temperance in August, and according to William Glenn, who administered his pledge, there was no reason to believe he violated it before leaving Richmond. The contrast between these testimonies reveals the gulf between perception and memory, between moral narrative and fact. Standing in the barroom, Snodgrass saw not only a man but a symbol. The election day environment, with its free whiskey and raucous patrons, confirmed his biases. As a physician and temperance advocate, he turned a dying friend into an example of moral failure. This lens might have been shaped by guilt. He had been one of the last people to speak to Poe before his death, and perhaps felt a need to rationalise the event. His version of the note from Walker introduces details not found in Walker's own letter, like referring to the tavern as Cotham Sergeants rather than Ryan's Poles, and moving the date from October 3rd to November 1st. It suggests he either misremembered or embellished the story. Edward Spencer, writing in 1881, exposed Snodgrass's manipulations. The Poe Society notes that Snodgrass's fervour led him to exaggerate the story and even manipulate evidence. Modern scholars treat his testimony with caution. When we sift the available accounts, what emerges is a scene less clear but more human. A young printer saw a man in distress and reached out to a friend. A doctor hurried through busy streets to assist a former colleague. A relative, fearing scandal and a repeat of past episodes, insisted on a hospital. In a bar filled with voters and beer, a great writer slid between consciousness and oblivion. This is not the melodrama of temperance pamphlets, nor the neat logic of conspiracies. It is a moment of vulnerability. Poe's hands, which once wrote the most measured of poems, shook. His voice, which once intoned "nevermore," muttered incoherently. His once carefully chosen attire was replaced by whatever garments came to hand. He had left Richmond with hopes of marriage and a magazine. He now sat near strangers who did not recognize him. Joseph Walker's note, preserved by accident, is one of the few fixed points in these lost days. It is a document of compassion. It calls Poe a gentleman and notes he is in need of immediate assistance. It does not mention drink or shame. It carries the urgency of a man who sees another in pain and reaches out. In contrast, Snodgrass's later accounts are documents of judgment. They reflect more of the writer than of the subject. As we reconstruct this chapter, we must decide which voices to trust. The note is simple and direct. Snodgrass's memory is elaborate and moralistic. Moran's letters are vivid but self-serving. The interplay of these voices shows how history is shaped not just by what happened, but by who tells it and why. Gunners Hall stands no longer. The block on East Lombard Street has been rebuilt and rerouted. On election day now, voters line up at school gyms and community centres, not taverns. The barroom where Poe sat has vanished like the names of those who bought him a drink or laughed at his mutterings. What remains is the image of a frail man in someone else's coat, carrying a stranger's cane, collapsing into the arms of men who half recognized him. It is here that the story of Edgar Allan Poe becomes not just a riddle, but a reflection on care and neglect. We are asked to imagine ourselves as Walker, as Snodgrass, as Herring. Do we help, or do we judge? Do we call for a doctor or deliver a lecture? The answer speaks less about Poe's death than about our own humanity. In the next chapter, we'll turn to the theories that sought to fill this void. The bottle theory that Snodgrass championed, the Cooping theory that election day rumours birthed, and the darker speculations of beating and murder. These explanations reveal as much about the fears and values of their proponents as they do about Poe. For now, we sit with that note, the only indisputable record of October 3rd. We let its simplicity steady us. There is a gentleman in need of immediate assistance. In the presence of unresolved mystery, the greatest kindness we can offer is not an answer, but an act of care. The story of Poe's death quickly became a fable about drink. Before his body was cold, temperance lecturers carried it into their meeting halls and held it up to the light. J.E. Snodgrass, the doctor and editor who had helped carry Poe from Gunners Hall to the hospital, took the lead. Within months he was touring the country, telling audiences that the man they admired died in a drunken debauch. His articles in the Women's Temperance paper and Beadle's Monthly hardened the narrative. Poe was besotted, destitute, and his fall proved the moral of the bottle. Snodgrass's commitment to temperance coloured his statements and, as later scholars discovered, led him to manipulate evidence. Still, his version spread. John Pendleton Kennedy, Poe's former employer, wrote in his diary that Poe had died from the effects of a debauch after a companion seduced him back to the bottle. Kennedy admitted he was repeating second-hand information, probably from Snodgrass. Other friends, like John Reuben Thompson, asserted he died in delirium from drunkenness. The bottle theory took hold not because it was proven, but because it fit a cultural script. A man of genius undone by his vices. Poe's relationship with alcohol was complicated. He had long confessed to his vulnerability. In letters and conversations, he admitted that a single glass of wine could send him into a state of excitement or depression. Susan Archer, Tally Weiss, recalled that physicians warned him after an illness in Richmond that another attack would be fatal. "If people would not tempt me, I would not fall," he replied. The line captures both his awareness of his weakness and his resentment of those who dangled drink before him. Friends agreed that his constitution was delicate. Later accounts suggest he had a particularly low tolerance for alcohol, meaning that even small amounts, or abrupt withdrawal, could intensify his unpredictable behavior. Modern researchers analyzing his life note that this low tolerance often left him unable to hold down drink, and that he oscillated between abstinence and sprees. He was not a habitual drunkard, but a man whose rare indulgences hit him hard. Because his tolerance was low, Poe sometimes used alcohol medicinally. He would take a sip of sherry or brandy before a lecture to steady his nerves, then abstain for months. Friends in Richmond insisted he had been sober and cheerful in the weeks before he left. In fact, he had joined the Shockoe Hill division of the Sons of Temperance in early July 1849, taking a formal pledge of abstinence. William J. Glenn, the worthy patriarch who administered the oath, remembered the night vividly. Poe stepped to the desk with unusual firmness and signed his name as if impatient for the opportunity. This ceremony made a powerful impression on the membership. Some doubted he would hold out, but they were determined to monitor him. Glenn later recalled that Poe maintained his pledge through the summer. When he saw him on the day he left Richmond, Poe was dressed in a neat dark suit and looked the picture of sobriety. After his death, members of the council went to Baltimore to investigate. They concluded he had not been drinking. His new coat had been replaced by an old, worn garment, and several valuables were missing. Dr. Moran, the physician who attended him, wrote that there was no smell of liquor on his breath, and that he did not die under the effect of any intoxicant. These testimonies challenge the image of Poe stumbling through Baltimore in a prolonged drunk. Even so, the bottle theory persists because it explains some of the symptoms recorded by Moran: tremors, hallucinations, and delirium. Modern medicine labels this condition delirium tremens, a severe form of alcohol withdrawal that can follow sudden abstinence. In 2024, David Galen, president of the Edgar Allan Poe Society of Baltimore, revisited the evidence and concluded that Poe most likely died of delirium tremens. Galen argues that surviving letters depict a man in the throes of alcoholism and grief. Poe had suffered cholera attacks and brain lesions, experienced a traumatic summer, and may have drank again during his journey. When he abruptly stopped, as he would have while travelling or when taken to hospital, withdrawal could have produced the tremors and hallucinations Moran described. Galen's analysis is sympathetic. It sees a man overwhelmed by sorrow and physical illness rather than a moral reprobate. It also aligns with Moran's account of continuous talking to imaginary objects and shaking limbs. Though scholars caution that Moran's reliability is suspect, others have proposed that Poe's reactions to alcohol hint at a genetic or metabolic condition. Biohistorian Arno Carlin suggested that Poe may have suffered from an enzyme disorder, an alcohol dehydrogenase deficiency, that, combined with a brain disease, could explain his extreme reactions to alcohol. In people with this deficiency, alcohol is metabolized to acetaldehyde but not further processed, leading to flushing, palpitations, and psychological disturbances after only a small amount of drink. Such a condition would mean Poe's occasional indulgences could precipitate severe symptoms, while prolonged abstinence could leave him susceptible to withdrawal. Carlin's theory is speculative, but it underscores that the bottle theory, as Snodgrass presented it, oversimplifies. It reduces a complex interplay of physiology, psychology, and circumstance to a single moral failing. Indeed, the moral dimension of the bottle theory is what made it so compelling in the 19th century. The temperance movement was gaining momentum. Alcohol was blamed for poverty, crime, and domestic violence. Snodgrass, a physician who had embraced the cause, seized on Poe's death as evidence of alcohol's ruinous power. His lecture, The Facts of Poe's Death and Burial, and his article in the Women's Temperance paper used Poe as a cautionary tale. Temperance audiences, already primed to believe that alcohol destroyed genius, accepted his story without question. Publishers like Rufus Griswold, who bore grudges against Poe, amplified it. Griswold's memoir, written as Poe's literary executor, depicted him as a drunkard and gambler expelled from the University of Virginia for his vices. The biography was widely read and long accepted as authoritative, spreading Snodgrass's narrative to readers who never attended a temperance lecture. Many of Poe's friends were outraged and wrote letters defending his character, but the stigma endured. Over time, the image of Poe as a tragic drunk fused with the gothic gloom of his stories, yet a closer look at Poe's life reveals patterns that complicate that image. His bouts of drinking appear to have been linked to periods of extreme stress or grief. After the death of his wife Virginia in 1847, he indeed spiraled into depression and increased his drinking, even attempting suicide with a laudanum in 1848. But by 1849 he was trying to reform. His letters from July complain of cholera and spasms. He writes that he can hardly hold a pen. Physicians in Richmond treated him for what they believed were brain lesions and heart disease. They warned him that another attack could be fatal. His response to Weiss, that he would not fall if people did not tempt him, suggests he took the warning seriously. Joining the Sons of Temperance was a public declaration of abstinence. William Glenn, who administered the oath, believed Poe kept it. Even Snodgrass joined the same division, though he later used Poe's death to denounce the bottle. This shared membership deepens the irony. The man who became the face of temperance lectures had been part of a temperance society with the man he maligned. When we return to the hospital, the bottle theory both clarifies and confuses. Dr. Moran's letter to Maria Clem describes Poe's tremor of the limbs and his busy, but not violent or active delirium, with vacant converse with spectral and imaginary objects. Such symptoms could indicate delirium tremens. Moran wrote that he could not induce tranquility until the second day, and that Poe repeatedly called out Reynolds before whispering, "Lord help my poor soul," and dying. He did not mention the smell of liquor. Some have argued that Poe's condition might have been caused by a combination of alcohol withdrawal and the calomel, mercurous chloride, he had taken for cholera, which can produce tremors and hallucinations. Others point out that malnutrition and dehydration following days of illness could produce similar symptoms with minimal alcohol consumption. Modern doctors note that delirium tremens often appears in habitual drinkers after 2 to 4 days of abstinence. Poe had been travelling and likely had little opportunity to drink. If he had taken a glass with friends on arriving in Baltimore, as some accounts claim, then been forced to abstain, he could have experienced withdrawal symptoms days later. What about the change of clothing? The bottle theory struggles to explain why Poe, after a simple drinking spree, would end up in cheap, ill-fitting garments. Snodgrass suggested he sold his clothes to buy drink, but those who saw him leave Richmond said he wore a new suit. Even if he needed money, he still had his watch and subscription funds. Selling his coat seems unlikely. The worn clothes point to robbery or cooping, or at least to the involvement of others. If he was incapacitated by drink, he would have been an easy target. The same vulnerability appears in the temperature of his temperance. In the temperance narrative, he is wholly responsible for his downfall. In the Cooping narrative, he is a victim of election day gangs. The truth may lie between a man with low tolerance who took a drink or two, was quickly incapacitated, and was robbed or exploited. The bottle theory alone cannot explain the missing days, the change of clothing, or the absence of money. The cultural context also matters. 19th century America was torn between indulgence and temperance. Alcohol was a common part of social life. Taverns were meeting places. Elections were fueled by whiskey. At the same time, the temperance movement sought to reform society and used stories of fallen men to rally support. Poe's death occurred at this intersection. Snodgrass and Griswold used his name to advance temperance. The Sons of Temperance used it to defend their pledge. Biographers from later decades either condemned him or defended him, often aligning with their own views on alcohol. An 1895 article in the Richmond Times, for instance, emphasized Poe's temperance pledge and argued that he refrained from drink from his initiation until his death. It noted that none of Poe's associates in Richmond remembered him taking a drink during that time. The article concluded that he likely died from a brain disease brought on by nervous temperament and mental strain rather than intoxication. Such defences were rarely as widely circulated as Snodgrass's lectures, but they persisted among those who knew him. Even the University of Virginia's student records were used to either condemn or exonerate him. Griswold claimed he was expelled for alcoholism, but the National Park Service clarifies that he left due to financial and family reasons. Griswold's misrepresentation of his university years fed the myth of a lifelong drunkard. In reality, Poe's drinking problem was less about quantity and more about susceptibility. He was the sort of person who could not hold his liquor. A glass of wine might unmoor him. A single binge might require days of recovery. The computational analysis of his writings notes that his consumption or withdrawal from alcohol intensified his unpredictable behavior. Yet his greatest periods of productivity, such as the years he wrote The Fall of the House of Usher and The Murders in the Rue Morgue, occurred during or after bouts of illness and abstinence. Alcohol was not his muse. If anything, it was an impediment he struggled to control. As we sift through these layers, we must also acknowledge the role of grief. Poe's drinking escalated after the death of his wife Virginia. Galen's argument that he died of delirium tremens takes this grief seriously. The computational analysis of his letters suggests that depression, not just drink, coloured his final years. If he was already physically weakened by cholera, malnutrition and brain lesions, as letters and medical reports suggest, then any amount of alcohol would have been dangerous. The question is not whether alcohol played a role. It almost certainly did, but whether it alone can explain his death. The bottle theory, as Snodgrass presented it, ignores medical, social and psychological factors. It reduces a life to a cautionary tale. A more nuanced view recognizes that Poe's final decline was likely a convergence of low tolerance, physical illness, grief, possible robbery and the social environment of Election Day Baltimore. In the end, the bottle theory tells us as much about the people who propagated it as it does about Poe. It reveals a nation struggling to define its relationship with alcohol and to moralize tragedy. It exposes the power of biographies to shape memory and the difficulty of disentangling fact from propaganda. For decades, Snodgrass's story eclipsed other narratives. Only in the 20th century did scholars begin to question it, revealing his temperance agenda and his manipulation of evidence. They unearthed letters like Glenn's and re-examined Moran's contradictions. Some proposed metabolic disorders. Others, like Galen, returned to delirium tremens. None can claim definitive proof. The bottle theory remains one lens among many through which to view his death. We acknowledge that Poe's struggle with alcohol was real and fraught. He knew his weakness and sometimes succumbed. He also strove for sobriety, joining a temperance society and keeping his pledge for at least several months. He was warned that another bout could be fatal, and responded with defiance tinged with resignation. His death may have been precipitated by drink, but it was shaped by illness, grief, social forces, and perhaps a body ill-equipped to metabolize alcohol. In listening to the bottle theory, we hear the echoes of those who loved him and those who judged him. We also hear the voice of a man who, in his final days, may have whispered not just "Lord help my poor soul," but also, "If people would not tempt me, I would not fall." Between these two pleas lies the complex human story that the bottle theory alone cannot contain. If you stroll today along East Lombard Street in Baltimore, there is no trace of Gunner's Hall. The bar and polling place where Poe was found has been replaced by a parking lot and a line of row houses. Yet in 1849, on the morning of October the 3rd, it was crowded with men clutching tickets bearing party emblems. Whiskey flowed freely. Poll watchers shouted names to clerks who scratched them into tally books. The city's elections were notorious for corruption. Political gangs were willing to go to great extremes to ensure the success of their candidates, stealing ballots, bribing judges and intimidating voters. In some wards, ruffians dragged unwilling men into back rooms, coops, where they were plied with liquor, beaten and sent in altered clothing to vote again and again. Baltimore had no voter registration system. Poll officials recognized voters by sight and party tickets. The city's Republican and Argus newspaper warned, "Be wardsick of the Whig tricks. Our opponents are at their old game again. Tickets are out with their candidates and the hickory emblem. Colonization on a large scale is to be resorted to. Illegal votes will be polled from a distance and otherwise. Coups have been started by them." The warnings were printed on October 1st and October 3rd, 1849, just as Poe's ship docked. The articles demonstrate that cooping was an acknowledged practice in Baltimore, and that voters in the 4th Ward, where Poe was found, feared it. The cooping theory, first proposed publicly in the 1870s by editor John R. Thompson, became one of the most enduring explanations for Poe's death. According to this scenario, Poe, perhaps weakened by illness or a drink, was kidnapped by a gang on September 28th or 29th. They locked him in a coop for several days, forced him to drink and drugged him to ensure compliance. To disguise him, they swapped his suit for shabby clothing and smeared his face. On election day, they pushed him through polling places to cast fraudulent ballots. In this view, his delirium was not the result of voluntary drinking, but of repeated intoxication and beatings at the hands of political thugs. The change of clothing, the straw hat, the cheap gabardine, his inability to stand and the cane he still clutched. The cooping theory ties these oddities into a coherent story. It also explains the timing. He was found at noon on October 3rd, the day after sheriff elections near a 4th Ward polling station. Despite its appeal, the cooping theory raises questions. Poe was not an obscure labourer but a writer known in Baltimore. He had family in the city, including his cousin Nielsen, who was himself a Whig delegate. How likely is it that a gang would risk kidnapping a man who might be recognised? And why would they keep him for 5 days, plied with liquor, without disposing of him sooner? Early supporters of the theory offered little evidence beyond coincidence. When feminist writer Elizabeth Oak Smith suggested in 1867 that Poe had been cruelly beaten at the instigation of a woman he offended, Snodgrass responded that Poe's death was due to drink, not foul play. Later writers amplified the cooping story with anonymous letters and hearsay. James A. Harrison reprinted a letter from an anonymous source claiming to have seen Poe in the coop, but the letter's origin remains unverified. Another account, published in 1872, alleged that Poe met old West Point friends who coaxed him into a champagne supper. He became drunk, wandered off, and was robbed and beaten by ruffians. These stories contradict each other. One blames an angry woman, another blames former classmates, yet another points to political gangs, yet they all rely on rumour. Recent scholarship has done much to evaluate cooping. Historian John Evangelist Walsh dismissed the theory partly because he found no mention of coops in the Baltimore Sun. He speculated instead that Poe was attacked by Elmira Royster Shelton's brothers, who followed him from Richmond and forced him to drink to break his engagement. In his narrative, John R. Thompson invented the Cooping story to shield the Royster brothers from suspicion. Walsh's book was marketed as a definitive solution, but the Poe Society notes that he offered little evidence for his murder theory and simply rehashed the usual information. Moreover, a careful search of period newspapers beyond the Sun found multiple references to cooping, including the Republican and Argus warnings. This evidence undermines Walsh's claim and reinforces that political cooping was real in 1849. It does not prove Poe was a victim, but it invalidates the assertion that cooping was a myth. Another letter, written by N.H. Morrison to biographer J.H. Ingram in 1874, hints that Neilson Poe knew more than he revealed. The story of Poe's death has never been told, Morrison wrote. Nelson Neilson Poe has all the facts, but I am afraid may not be willing to tell them. The actual facts are less discreditable than the common reports published. Poe came to the city in the midst of an election, and that election was the cause of his death. William Hand Brown echoed the rumour. The general belief here is that Poe was seized by one of these gangs, cooped, stupefied with liquor, dragged out and voted, and then turned adrift to die. Brown's letter suggests that local opinion in the 1870s linked Poe's death to election gangs. Elizabeth Ellicott Poe and Villa Poe Wilson, descendants of Poe's family, wrote in 1930 that their relative was shanghaied shortly after his arrival in Baltimore, given liquor and opium to which he was peculiarly susceptible, and while in that irresponsible condition held until election day. They even claimed that a man named Pisano confessed the story to relatives. None of these assertions is supported by court records, but together they illustrate how the cooping theory became part of family law. The physical details of Poe's condition can fit either cooping or beating. When Snodgrass and Henry Herring found him, he wore a cheap gabardine coat, ill-fitting trousers and a straw hat. He had no vest or neckcloth, and his shoes were run down. He could not stand without assistance. His hair was unkempt. His face was pale and distressed. These details may result from days in a coop or from a mugging on the street after a spree. They could also be explained by robbery. He might have been attacked, had his suit stolen and replaced with whatever the robbers had on hand, then left near the polling place. The cane he carried belonged to Dr. Carter, not to him. If he was conscious during the theft, he might have insisted on keeping it, perhaps because it contained a hidden sword. If he'd been cooped, the cane's presence is harder to explain. One imagines a gang disarming their victim. There is no record that his cane accompanied him to the hospital. Dr. Moran wrote nothing about it. In this sense, the cane stands as a ghostly reminder of the last known moment of control Poe had before he vanished. Walsh's murder theory adds another layer of intrigue. He posits that Sarah Elmira Royster's brothers, angered by her engagement to Poe, followed him to Baltimore, assaulted him, and forced him to drink so that his pledge to the Sons of Temperance would be broken and the engagement called off. He further suggests that John R. Thompson invented the cooping theory to protect the Royster brothers. this story reads like melodrama. There is no evidence that Elmira's brothers, who may not even have existed, travelled after him. Elmira wrote that her family disapproved of the match but gave no hint of violence. The only source for this theory is Walsh's speculation. The Poe Society notes that his book is rather dubious as scholarship. If we treat it as a novel, it is compelling. If we treat it as history, it is unsubstantiated. Other murder tales appear in 19th century magazines. Elizabeth Oakes Smith wrote that at the instigation of a woman he had injured, Poe was cruelly beaten, blow upon blow, by a ruffian. She implied that his brain fever, and by extension his death, followed this beating. The statement is vague, the woman is unnamed, the ruffian is not identified. Was it a jealous lover, a rival writer, a creditor's henchman? Later writers embellished the story. In 1879, Alexander Hinz, a Baltimore attorney, sent an anonymous letter to Thompson describing a friend's account of Poe in the Coop. John Joyce reprinted the identical letter as if he had heard it personally. Didier, in his 1872 article, The Grave of Poe, described a champagne supper followed by robbery and beating. These conflicting narratives share two elements, a beating and alcohol. They might be variations on a single rumour that a drunken Poe was attacked. They might also be creative expansions by writers seeking to sell books. The murder theory is attractive because it provides a culprit and satisfies our desire for a villain. It channels the anger of those who loved Poe. It offers revenge to those who feel he was wronged. But the historian must ask, who would have a motive? Elmira's brothers, if they existed, would have endangered their sister by exposing her to scandal. A creditor would have no reason to kill a debtor who could work. A jealous rival might wish him harm but would risk prosecution. Political gangs, on the other hand, had motive and precedent for kidnapping and violence. Yet there is no record of his vote being cast, no witness to his presence in the cup, no confession from a gang member. Pisano's alleged confession remains a family rumour. In the absence of evidence, speculation flourishes. Modern scholars caution that Cooping cannot be dismissed but should be treated with scepticism. Doug Bolter's research uncovered newspaper ads from 1849 warning of coups and election fraud. This confirms the practice but not Poe's involvement. The Poe Society suggests that the Cooping theory was slow to gain attention because it implicated political parties and illegal activity. The Whig Party, which controlled Baltimore's politics, would not have wanted a scandal to become public. Even if Nielsen Poe knew more, he may have remained silent to protect family or party. It is also possible that he knew nothing. In a city where Cooping was both common and clandestine, who would publicly confess? Only decades later, when the events were distant and participants dead, did the theory emerge. By then, details had blurred. What remained were impressions and fears. The Cooping and murder theories share a common theme: Edgar Poe as victim. In these narratives he is robbed of agency, a passive body manipulated by others. The image resonates because of his own stories, characters buried alive, imprisoned in dungeons, hypnotized at the brink of death. It also appeals to our sense of injustice. But these theories also risk obscuring his choices. Poe may have been lured to drink. He may have taken a toast with friends. He may have left a tavern alone and been attacked. In a city teeming with election day gangs, he was vulnerable, but he was not simply a puppet. His earlier decision to travel alone, carrying money, reveals a certain naivety or hubris. His letter to Maria instructing her not to sign her name suggests he suspected danger. Whether he faced that danger willingly or was seized by it remains unknown. As we weigh the theories, We note that each arises from a different set of values. Temperance activists like Snodgrass needed Poe to die of drink. Political historians like Thompson needed him to be a victim of election fraud. Romantic biographers like Walsh needed him to be murdered by jealous rivals. Each theory is a mirror reflecting the concerns of the teller more than the facts of the case. They reveal the ways we use stories to make sense of randomness. The evidence for cooping, a warning in a newspaper, a change of clothes, invites plausible hypotheses but not conclusions. The evidence for murder, a rumour of a beating, a speculation about Elmira's brothers, is even thinner. Yet these stories persist because they fill the void left by the missing days. Perhaps the most reasonable approach is to accept ambiguity. Poe's death occurred in a context of political corruption, personal frailty and social instability. He arrived in a city on the eve of an election with little money and a borrowed cane. He vanished for 5 days. He was found at a polling place in a condition that could result from drink, disease, beating, or forced intoxication. He cried out a name that no one could explain. In the absence of a confession or a medical diagnosis, each theory remains speculative. The Cooping theory reminds us of the brutality of antebellum politics. The murder theories remind us of the dangers of fame and the violence of jealousy. But neither can claim the weight of proof. In the next chapter, we will explore medical explanations, diseases, toxins, and modern hypotheses that attempt to interpret his symptoms without invoking conspiracies. For now, we leave Poe in that ambiguous space between victim and agent, between political intrigue and personal tragedy. His story invites us not to choose a culprit, but to consider how easy it is to fall into a narrative that suits our beliefs, and how difficult it is to live with uncertainty. In the end, perhaps the most humane explanation is that Poe died because his body could no longer sustain him. He was 40 years old, living in a time when cholera and tuberculosis were common, when medical treatments included mercury pills and bloodletting. His life had been marked by orphanhood, poverty, and the deaths of loved ones. He wrote of hearts beating under floorboards and voices whispering from beyond. His health deteriorated. His brain was the site of pain, creativity, and disease. He travelled alone, carrying money and dreams. He disappeared into a city's election day chaos, emerged delirious, and died 4 days later. The theories we craft, disease, poison, brain, environment, are attempts to make sense of a human end. They reflect our fascination with Poe's mind and our discomfort with uncertainty. As we leave this chapter, we do so not with an answer, but with an appreciation for the complexity of the case. The spectrum of proposed illnesses reveals the intersection of medicine, culture, and narrative. We see how scientific advances can test old hypotheses, heavy metals, how medical knowledge is applied retroactively, rubbers, Parkinson's, and how physical artifacts can inspire new stories, brain mass. We also see the limitations of retrospective diagnosis and the risk of imposing modern categories on historical lives. Poe's death remains unsolved. Perhaps that is fitting. His work invites us into rooms where hearts whisper, into houses that collapse under their own weight, into labyrinths where one can become lost. His death, like his stories, resists closure. In listening to the chorus of diseases and poisons, we hear echoes of his own fascination with the boundary between life and death. When he wrote the sickness, the nausea, the pitiless pain, he might as well have been forecasting his own end. The final word is not a diagnosis, but a recognition that some mysteries, especially those involving the human body and mind, may remain unresolved. In the spaces between these theories, we find the truth of his humanity. A man weakened by illness, perhaps poisoned by his era, perhaps cursed by his genes, certainly worn down by grief, stepping into the fog and leaving us with questions. Modern diagnostic approaches are limited by the absence of preserved tissue. We can analyse hair, letters, diaries, and contemporaneous accounts. We cannot examine his brain or blood. The hair analysis tells us he did not die of heavy metal poisoning. The fact that he drank water without difficulty weakens the rabies theory. The absence of a recorded animal bite makes rabies unlikely. The brain mass might be a tumour or a mummified brain. The carbon monoxide theory is intriguing but untestable. The enzyme disorder theory explains his reactions to alcohol but cannot be proven. The Parkinsonism theory is consistent with his symptoms but remains speculative. The cholera and heart disease he endured are documented. In the face of this uncertainty, we must accept that multiple factors likely converged. Poe's constitution was fragile. His diet was poor. He was grieving and stressed. He had a neurological condition. He was exposed to toxins and perhaps to infectious disease. His death may not have one cause but many. To tell this story gently is to recognize the humanity in speculation. People want reasons. A brain tumor gives the tragedy a physical form. Rabies conjures a gothic beast. Carbon monoxide is an invisible killer. Heavy metals evoke poisoning. Each theory reflects our desire for closure and our fear of randomness. The heavy metal tests show how far we will go to quantify our curiosities, sacrificing strands of hair for answers. The carbon monoxide theory reminds us that progress can harm us. The rabies hypothesis demonstrates the power of modern medicine to reinterpret the past. The tumour story reveals how exhumation can unearth more questions than it resolves. The enzyme disorder invites empathy for those whose bodies betray them. Parkinsonism recasts Poe as a man whose mind was invaded by a disease discovered decades earlier, suffering in silence. Even the cholera letter invites compassion for a man who endured severe illness and continued to work. Yet another explanation is the simplest: exhaustion. Poe had been travelling continuously, giving lectures, visiting old friends and fiancés, surviving cholera and cholera treatments, coping with poverty and grief. He wrote to Maria that he had had the cholera or spasms quite as bad. Doctors in Richmond told him another attack could be fatal. He set off anyway, boarding boats and trains, sleeping little, carrying money and letters. When he arrived in Baltimore, the city was in the throes of election fever. Taverns were rowdy. He may have been caught up in cooping or robbed. He may have taken a drink to steady his nerves and found himself violently ill. Under such stress, his body could fail. Exposure, his cousin Nielsen said, brought on a swelling of the brain. In this view, his death was the result of cumulative wear and tear on a fragile body. The brain lesion theory offers a bridge between disease and exhaustion. As early as 1847, Maria Louise Shue, a nurse and friend, believed Poe had a lesion on his brain. She told Dr. Valentine Mott, who examined him and agreed. Dr. John Francis later concurred. A lesion could produce headaches, seizures, mood swings, and cognitive decline. Combined with cholera, heavy metals, alcohol, and stress, it could lead to collapse. A lesion might also make him more sensitive to mercury or carbon monoxide, compounding their effects. The calcified mass found in his skull could be the remains of such a lesion, though this is speculation. If we accept the lesion theory, we see a man living with a chronic neurological condition that predisposed him to catastrophic episodes. It frames his final decline not as a sudden event but as the culmination of years of neurological deterioration. Another cluster of diseases proposed for Poe includes syphilis, meningeal inflammation, apoplexy stroke, diabetes, and epilepsy. Syphilis can cause neurological symptoms and insanity. Some writers have suggested that Poe, a man of the 19th century literary circles, could have contracted it. However, there is no record of him showing signs of syphilitic lesions or the gummas associated with late-stage disease. Diabetes can cause confusion and coma, but Poe showed no signs of polyuria or weight loss. Stroke or apoplexy could cause sudden delirium and paralysis, but the progression of his symptoms over several days is less typical. Epilepsy is more consistent with his bouts of unresponsiveness and fits, and some biographers believe he may have had temporal lobe epilepsy. Dr. John Moran described Poe's behaviour as nervous prostration, and some scholars interpret this as epileptic seizures. Without an EEG, we cannot confirm. Each of these diagnoses emerges from patterns in his behaviour but lacks evidence. Neurological explanations continue to surface. In 2024, writer and investigator Joe Nickell proposed that Poe suffered from Parkinsonism, a disease described by James Parkinson in 1817. Parkinsonism involves the degradation of dopamine-producing cells, leading to tremors, slow movement, stiffness, and facial masking. Hallucinations can occur, particularly in dementia with Lewy bodies, a variant of Parkinson's disease. Nickell points out that Poe's trembling, staggering gait and vacant conversations align with these symptoms. The repeated cry of Reynolds may be akin to vocal tics seen in advanced Parkinsonism. He argues that the delirium described by Moran could be part of a Parkinsonian crisis, possibly precipitated by exhaustion and exposure. This theory reframes Poe not as a victim of poison or villains, but as a patient with a degenerative disease. It invites compassion, suggesting his final days were not a moral failure but a medical one. It also underscores that such diseases were little understood in his era. Without dopamine replacement drugs, a Parkinsonian crisis would be fatal. Diseases of metabolism have also been proposed. Arno Carlin, a biohistorian, suggested that Poe might have had alcohol dehydrogenase deficiency. This enzyme converts ethanol to acetaldehyde. In some individuals, a deficiency leads to extreme reactions to small amounts of alcohol, flushing, heart palpitations, nausea, and rapid intoxication. Combined with a brain disease such as lesions or a tumour, the deficiency could produce violent fits and delirium. Poe's letters and friends' testimonies describe such fits. The theory attempts to reconcile his occasional drinking with the severity of his symptoms. It also explains why periods of abstinence did not spare him. Acetaldehyde accumulation can occur with repeated exposure. However, there is no way to test his enzymes now. It is an intriguing, unprovable hypothesis, highlighting how genetics can shape our perception of vice. Some point to his brain. When Poe's body was moved in 1875 to a more prominent grave at the Westminster Burying Ground, workers reported a mass rolling around inside his skull. Newspapers described it as a small hard object, the size of a walnut. A forensic pathologist later suggested it could be a calcified brain tumour. Brain tumours, especially meningiomas, can calcify after death and survive longer than brain tissue. A tumour pressing on his frontal lobe could explain mood swings, hallucinations, and behaviour changes. If the mass was indeed a tumour, it might have contributed to his cognitive decline and susceptibility to illness. Yet there is no autopsy report. The observation comes from cemetery workers who were not medically trained. Another explanation is that the mass was a dehydrated brain. Although rare, brains can mummify under certain conditions. Without tissue analysis, the tumour theory is speculation. It shows how physical artifacts can spawn narratives that outpace evidence. Another modern hypothesis is rabies. In 1996, Dr. R. Michael Benitez, a cardiologist and Poe enthusiast, published an article in the Maryland Medical Journal diagnosing Poe with rabies. He based his conclusion on Dr. Moran's account of Poe's final days, noting symptoms such as delirium, agitation, tremors, and difficulty drinking. Benitez argued that Poe's refusal of alcohol and his trouble swallowing water, hydrophobia, were classic signs of rabies. He pointed out that about 1/4 of rabies victims do not recall being bitten, and that rabies can cause hallucinations. Benitez concluded that the timeline, Poe became symptomatic and died within 4 days, matched the course of rabies. The theory captivated the public. Newspapers hailed the mystery solved. Yet the evidence is thin. Benitez relied on an 1885 account by Moran that Poe could not drink water. But earlier manuscripts reveal that Moran wrote Poe drank half a glass of water without difficulty. The hydrophobia evidence evaporates. Without it, rabies becomes less plausible. Furthermore, Poe had no known exposure to animals in the weeks before his death, and no signs of a bite were recorded. While rabies can cause delirium, it does not fit all of Poe's symptoms, particularly the pattern of improvement and decline noted by witnesses. One such toxin is carbon monoxide. Poe lived and travelled during a period when coal gas lighting was common. Gas jets burned in homes and streets, producing light and carbon monoxide. The Rice University Catalyst magazine noted that carbon monoxide binds to hemoglobin more readily than oxygen, causing hypoxia. Chronic exposure produces headaches, nausea, facial paralysis, delusions, and hallucinations. The article speculates that Poe may have been exposed to low levels of carbon monoxide in gas-lit rooms, leading to drooping eyelids and a slanted mouth in some portraits. It also points out that carbon monoxide poisoning can mimic drunkenness and can precipitate confusion, dizziness, and hallucinations. A researcher suggested this may have contributed to his condition, yet the hair tests were inconclusive for carbon monoxide exposure. Carbon monoxide leaves no clear marker in hair, and there is no way to retroactively measure his blood gas levels. The theory remains a possibility, a reminder of how environmental hazards can affect health in ways unseen. Modern researchers, with microscopes and mass spectrometers, approach the mystery differently. In 2000, the Poe Society sacrificed 3 strands of hair, 2 from Poe and 1 from Virginia, for heavy metal analysis. Using inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry, they measured levels of arsenic, lead, mercury, nickel, and uranium. The results surprised some. Poe's arsenic level was 15 times the modern normal level, but only about 2/3 the amount associated with arsenic poisoning. His lead level decreased by 1/3 over time and was 3 to 4 times the normal background, but not high enough to cause symptoms. His mercury level increased by 264%, likely due to calomel, the mercury-based medication used to treat cholera. But even this level was 30 times below the threshold for mercury poisoning. Other metals, nickel, uranium, were negligible. The hair sample was estimated to represent exposure from 2 to 5 months before his death. The conclusion: Poe carried an elevated burden of heavy metals, but not enough to kill him. Mercury may have contributed to tremors and hallucinations, but it was far below a fatal dose. Lead could have caused irritability and stomach problems, but not death. Arsenic was present, but not at toxic levels. These results effectively rule out heavy metal poisoning, though they open the door to other environmental toxins. We begin with the diseases of his time. By 1849, tuberculosis had killed his mother, his brother, his foster mother Frances Allen, and his young wife Virginia. In the weeks before his death, he wrote of cholera. The summer of 1849 saw an outbreak across the eastern United States. In a letter dated July 7th, he confessed he'd been so ill, possibly with cholera, and could now hardly hold the pen. He survived but emerged weakened. Dr. John W. Francis, a prominent New York physician, examined him and believed he had heart disease. Poe denied it vehemently, asserting that his heart was sound, but the diagnosis remained. Some friends noticed he often clasped his chest and complained of palpitations. Others noted periods of trembling, shaking, and difficulty walking. Later writers proposed epilepsy, noting the abrupt collapses and fits described by observers. Susan Weiss wrote that he had been ill during the summer and that doctors told him another attack would be fatal. These historical diagnoses speak to how physicians of the 1840s understood illness as a combination of constitution, environment, and moral behaviour. We sit now with the doctor's notes and the shadows of diagnoses. For months, Edgar Poe's health had been precarious. Letters from July 1849 reveal a man racked by spasms and cholera. He told his mother-in-law Maria Clem he could hardly hold the pen. Physicians in Richmond suspected heart disease and brain lesions. Susan Weiss recalled that he was so pale and tremulous that his doctors warned another attack would kill him. He was, by his own admission, easily overcome by small amounts of drink. He had lived through periods of near starvation, grief, and fever. Yet no single illness captured the public imagination until after his death, when speculation rushed to fill the void. In the years since, physicians, biographers, and enthusiasts have proposed a catalogue of maladies: tuberculosis, diabetes, epilepsy, rabies, carbon monoxide poisoning, heavy metal poisoning, brain tumours, syphilis, and rare enzyme disorders. Each theory tells us as much about the era that proposed it as about Poe. We have now traversed across a long expanse, from the candles of Poe's birth to the fog of his final days, through taverns and hospital corridors, through letters and lectures, through cholera and Cooping and calomel. In this chapter we take another slow step, into a room lit by the green glow of a modern computer screen. Here we sit with new documents and diagnoses, listening for echoes of the past in the language of today. We approach quietly, because what we are about to consider asks us to rethink our assumptions about Poe's end. In the winter of 2024, a new hypothesis entered the conversation, like a gentle knock on a library door. Joe Nickell, an investigator for Skeptical Inquirer, sifted through the accounts of Poe's last week, his tremors, his stiff gait, his hallucinations of shadowy killers, and his repeated call for Reynolds, and arrived at a conclusion that surprised many. These, he argued, were not the signs of drunkenness, rabies, or brutality, but of an ailment scarcely understood in Poe's own era, Parkinson's disease. Nickell noted that the disease, formally described by James Parkinson in 1817, produces slow movement, muscular tremor, partial facial paralysis, and peculiar posture and gait, though symptoms vary widely. Hallucinations can accompany the condition, especially as it progresses. In Poe's time, such hallucinations would have been misinterpreted as delirium or the effects of drink. Poe's tremors might have been mistaken for delirium tremens, his stiff movements for drunken staggering. Nickell observed that witnesses described him moving rather stiffly and suffering tremors and hallucinations. The final blow to his head widely speculated to be from a drunken fall or an attack, could instead have been a fall caused by Parkinson's. If true, this reinterpretation demands compassion rather than condemnation. We are asked to see Poe not as a failing moral agent, but as a man whose brain was betraying him. Parkinsonism, as described by Nickel, is not a single disease but a group of disorders tied to the depletion of dopamine-producing cells in the brain. It tends to emerge in middle age and can manifest differently in each person. Some patients experience slow movements and stiffness. Others, tremors and falls. Many develop hallucinations, visions that feel real but have no external source. These hallucinations often involve people or animals. They flicker at the edge of vision, the brain playing tricks on itself. The Parkinson's Foundation explains that hallucinations occur when someone sees, hears or feels something that isn't actually there. They're best described as deceptions or tricks played by the brain that involve the senses. Visual hallucinations are the most common type. Patients may see animals running by or deceased loved ones sitting in the room. They can also feel presence hallucinations, the sensation that someone stands behind them or is in the room. Many people with Parkinson's retain insight, recognizing that what they see is not real, though as the disease progresses, this insight can fade. Hallucinations are often fleeting and benign but can become threatening or bothersome. They can be triggered by medication, by stress, or by the basic chemical changes in the brain that accompany the disease. When we apply this lens to Poe's final days, certain moments take on new meaning. His vacant converse with spectral and imaginary objects on the walls, as recorded by Dr. Moran, might have been Parkinsonian hallucinations rather than delirium from drink or fever. His repeated cry of Reynolds, a name that has confounded biographers, could be an echo of a presence hallucination, the sense that someone is there but cannot be seen. In Parkinson's disease, such presence hallucinations are common, a feeling that someone stands nearby, perhaps named and called upon. His stiff movements, described by observers, align with the motor symptoms of Parkinsonism. His sudden falls could be due to postural instability rather than physical assault. His bursts of melancholy and fear may reflect the mood swings associated with the disease. The fact that he had no trouble swallowing, as de Widziak notes, undermines the rabies theory but is consistent with Parkinsonism, which does not typically affect swallowing early on. This does not prove that Poe had Parkinson's. Retrospective diagnosis is inherently speculative. We cannot examine his brain to confirm the presence of Lewy bodies or measure dopamine levels. But Nickel's proposal invites a different kind of empathy. It suggests that what appeared to his contemporaries as weakness or vice might have been symptoms of a neurological disorder. It challenges the moral narratives that have long surrounded his death. As Nickel writes, recognizing that Poe's tremors and hallucinations were caused by Parkinsonism rather than drink should replace the excessive disparagement of Poe's final years with a more truthful, insightful, and respectful portrait. It also encourages us to look at the intersection of illness and morality in the 19th century. Poe lived in a time when mental and neurological illnesses were poorly understood. People spoke of brain fever, mania a potu, delirium from drink, and nervous prostration. A man trembling in a street was assumed drunk, not sick. In our modern understanding, we can see that such assumptions often mask diseases beyond the comprehension of the era. Hallucinations in Parkinson's disease can be subtle. According to the Parkinson's Foundation, they are not dreams or nightmares. They occur when the person is awake, often in low light. Visual hallucinations in PD are usually benign, like seeing a cat run by or a deceased loved one sitting calmly. People may be aware that they are hallucinating. This awareness is called retaining insight. However, as the disease progresses, insight can diminish. Medication can induce or worsen hallucinations, as PD treatments increase dopamine or alter neurotransmitter balances. Stress, dehydration, infection, and sleep deprivation can also trigger episodes. When hallucinations are coupled with delusions, illogical, irrational beliefs unanchored in reality, the risk for aggression and confusion increases. In some cases, hallucinations and delusions point to a related disorder called Lewy body dementia. These medical facts frame Poe's symptoms in a new light. He was under extraordinary stress, exhausted from travel and illness, likely dehydrated. If he had a Parkinsonian disorder, these factors could have precipitated the hallucinations and tremors noted by his physician. It is important to note that hallucinations are also common in delirium tremens and other conditions. Poe's symptoms could have many causes: alcohol withdrawal, mercury poisoning, carbon monoxide, brain lesions, metabolic disorders, or combinations thereof. The Parkinson's theory does not negate these possibilities. It simply adds another layer. It suggests that we consider how neurological disease can mimic other states. It also encourages us to look beyond the moralizing lens through which many have viewed Poe. If his tremors were not evidence of drunkenness but of a progressive disorder, then the temperance lectures that used his death as a warning misrepresented his suffering. Recognizing this misrepresentation invites us to extend compassion not just to Poe, but to all who are judged by symptoms rather than diagnosed conditions. There is also a poetic resonance to this theory. Parkinson's disease is often called the shaking palsy, and Poe's life was a series of shakes and stabilizations. He was shaken by the early deaths of his parents and wife, by poverty, by rejection from his foster father, by illness, by the fluctuations of his own mind. In his stories he wrote of hearts beating under floorboards, of bodies bricked into walls, of sinister ticks in rooms. Tremor was both literal and metaphorical in his work. To imagine that his own brain trembled in those last days is to see a tragic parallel between his art and his body. His hallucinations of shadowy killers recall the spectral figures in his tales. His belief that he overheard men plotting his murder can be read as a presence hallucination, an internal drama projected outward. If his mind conjured Reynolds as a presence behind him, then his final words, "Lord help my poor soul," take on new poignancy. He may have been pleading not for forgiveness for moral weakness, but for relief from a brain that betrayed him. The Parkinson's hypothesis also prompts us to reconsider the social responses to his illness. In 1849, there was little understanding of mental health and neurological disease. A man muttering to walls and shaking was assumed to be a drunkard or madman. Snodgrass, a temperance advocate, described Poe in Beastly Intoxication, a portrayal shaped by moral judgment. Dr. Moran, who treated Poe, wrote of him conversing with spectral objects but insisted he smelled no alcohol. In the absence of a modern diagnosis, each observer interpreted his behaviour through their own lens. The Parkinson's theory encourages us to be humble about such interpretations. It reminds us that our understanding of illness evolves. In Poe's time, epilepsy was thought to be demonic possession. Schizophrenia was a moral failing. Parkinson's was known but misunderstood. Today, we still misread behaviours we don't understand. By approaching Poe with the possibility of a neurological disorder, we practice the empathy we hope future generations will extend to us. This empathy extends beyond Poe himself. The Parkinson's theory invites us to consider the thousands of people living with Parkinson's disease and Parkinsonism today. Hallucinations are a non-motor symptom experienced by many with the disease. They are often side effects of medications and can be managed when recognized. People with PD may see small animals, strangers or loved ones in their rooms, or feel as if someone stands behind them. These experiences can be frightening or comforting. In some cases, patients know the hallucination is not real. In others, they do not. Loved ones and caregivers are taught to respond gently, validating the person's feelings rather than arguing. When hallucinations become threatening or persistent, doctors adjust medications or provide therapies. Reading about Poe's hallucinations in this context fosters understanding. It suggests that if he had lived in our time, he might have received a diagnosis and support rather than judgment and suspicion. As we contemplate this new theory, we also acknowledge its limits. Retrospective diagnosis is rarely definitive. The Parkinson's theory is built on interpretations of symptoms recorded by individuals whose reliability is debated. Moran's accounts changed over time. Snodgrass's moral lens is suspect. Nichols' hypothesis cannot be proven. It must sit alongside other possibilities: alcohol withdrawal, cholera, carbon monoxide, brain lesions, heavy metal exposure, genetic disorders. Each explanation highlights different aspects of the evidence. The value of the Parkinson's theory lies not in its certainty, but in the conversation it fosters. It opens the door to a more compassionate reading of Poe's life and death. It challenges us to examine how we interpret and judge behavior. It reminds us that the human mind is complex, and that our interpretations are contingent on our knowledge and biases. We move slowly through this chapter because the subject invites careful reflection. It is not a chapter of revelation, but of reconsideration. It invites us to imagine Poe moving stiffly across a room, his hands trembling, his vision filled with flickers of light or shadows. It invites us to see his cry of "Reynolds" as a symptom rather than a clue. It invites us to revisit the hospital room where he lay, not as a scene of drunken debauch or conspiracy, but as a scene of neurological crisis. It invites us to think about how many others in his time suffered similar symptoms without understanding or support. And it invites us to ask softly how we today interpret the behaviors of those around us, and whether we do so with humility and empathy. As we leave this chapter, we carry the Parkinson's theory with us as a lens rather than a verdict. It gives us one more way to understand Poe's final days and to connect his life to our own. We still do not know what killed him, but we know more about the possibilities. We know that tremors, hallucinations, and falls can be signs of a disease rather than a moral failing. We know that compassion is a better response than scorn. We know that our understanding of illness evolves, and that future generations will reinterpret our stories. Poe himself wrote that we loved with a love that was more than love. Perhaps in revisiting his death, we can love him with a care that is more than curiosity. In the next and final chapter, we will step back and look at the legacy of this unsolved death. We will consider how the mystery itself has shaped his reputation and our fascination. For now, we pause in this quiet room with its flicker of green light, letting the possibility of Parkinson settle like dust in the air. We close our eyes and feel the quiet. The candle we lit in the first chapter has burned low. The fog has risen and fallen. We have walked down damp streets and up creaking staircases. We have listened to doctors and detectives, temperance advocates and modern neurologists. We've traced patterns in hair and weighed variations in the word Reynolds. And still, after all the theories and all the empathy, there is no final answer. The man we followed into the fog has never emerged. We must make our peace with mystery. The Edgar Allan Poe Society warns us that his death may remain forever a mystery. Its scholars confess that the few tantalizing facts we have do not lead to any single satisfactory conclusion, and that the puzzle continues to tease and entice. It is not for lack of trying. People have tested his hair for heavy metals, exhumed his bones, and invented elaborate stories of cooping, murder, and disease. Yet no explanation fits all the facts. There is paradoxically a kind of relief in this admission. In an age that hungers for answers, there is comfort in a story that refuses to be resolved. The unsolved death invites us to sit with uncertainty, to accept that some truths slip between lines of evidence and become legend. This unresolved ending has become inseparable from Poe's identity. What happened to Poe is often the first question visitors ask at Poe museums and historical houses. They arrive knowing his tales of the macabre and the detective stories he invented, but they lean in, almost conspiratorially, to ask about his death. The Crime Reads journalist Mark Dawidziak notes that Poe's death is one of the great stage exits in literary history. It is a double-barreled mystery. Where was he during those missing days and what killed him? And its very ambiguity keeps him alive in popular imagination. Dawidziak observes that the mystery is not a footnote, but a major factor in Poe's enduring fame. It ensures that his biography often begins not with his birth, but with his death. We can feel this in the way stories about Poe's life are told. The narrative arcs backward from that dark Baltimore afternoon. His final days cast a long shadow over his childhood, his marriage and his work. The man who wrote tales of crypts and ciphers left behind a riddle. It is as if his final act was another story, one in which he appears as a character, inviting future readers to play detective. Because there is no solution, the death itself has become part of the performance of remembering him. Every January 19th, on the anniversary of his birth, a stranger dressed in black with a wide-brimmed hat and white scarf used to slip through the gates of the Westminster Burying Ground in Baltimore. In the grey light of morning, this figure, nicknamed the Poe Toaster, poured a glass of cognac or sometimes cherry brandy, Amontillado or Scotch whiskey, and raised a silent toast to the poet. He left 3 red roses and the half-empty bottle beside the tomb, then disappeared into the streets. The tradition may have begun as early as the 1930s and continued until 1998, perhaps passed from father to son. For decades, crowds gathered in the cold before dawn, hoping to glimpse the toaster. No one ever saw his face. His tribute was both private and public. It honoured Poe and performed the mystery of Poe's life. The roses were said to represent Poe, his wife Virginia, and his mother-in-law Maria Clem. The choice of cognac remains unexplained. Some speculated it was a family tradition, others that it was a nod to one of his characters. When the original toaster disappeared after 1998, the Maryland Historical Society revived the ritual in 2016, understanding that the act itself is a form of storytelling. To raise a glass to Poe is to acknowledge the unresolved, to toast both his life and the darkness at its end. The continuation of this tradition illustrates how the mystery of his death encourages participation. It invites us into the story, not to solve it, but to inhabit it. People leave coins, quills, Amontillado and ravens at his grave. Biographers retell his last hours with new emphasis. Playwrights imagine what transpired in those missing days. Even the US Postal Service has issued stamps with his face, while Halloween costumes of Poe proliferate. The unresolved death permits reinvention. It ensures that each generation can project its own anxieties and hopes onto his story, whether those are fears of political corruption, fascination with disease, or reflections on mental health. In this way, the unsolved death does what his stories do. It encourages interpretation. The fact that his death remains open also mirrors the thematic concerns of his writing. Poe's tales dwell on the boundary between life and death. the thin veil between consciousness and the unknown. In The Premature Burial, a man is obsessed with being entombed alive. In The Fall of the House of Usher, the living and the dead bleed into each other. In The Black Cat, guilt manifests as a beating heart within the walls. Poe himself expressed fascination with death as an ultimate mystery. In the final paragraphs of his essay Eureka, he wrote of the dissolution of the universe into the divine. Because nothing was, therefore all things are. His death replicates this aesthetic. It is as if he staged his departure to leave a story that would forever mirror his themes. Even the possibility that he died from Parkinson's disease, with hallucinations and presence voices, echoes his character's experiences of being haunted by unseen forces. The speculation about his death thus deepens, rather than diminishes, the artistry of his work. It creates an external resonance. The man who wrote about the edges of consciousness died in a way that invites endless contemplation. There is another dimension to this legacy: the role his death plays in discussions of addiction, illness, and morality. For decades, Snodgrass's temperance lecture dominated the narrative, presenting him as a moral cautionary tale. This portrayal shaped how some readers approached his writing. They saw the melancholy and darkness not as creative choices but as consequences of vice. Later researchers have challenged this view, highlighting his efforts to stay sober and his likely neurological and physical ailments. Modern interpretations, like the Parkinson's theory, cast him as a victim of disease rather than moral failings. These shifting perspectives show how the unsolved death serves as a canvas for cultural debates. The story of his decline has been used to argue for temperance, to advocate for medical empathy, and to explore the stigma of mental illness. It reveals more about the society telling the story than about the man himself. The unresolved nature of his death has also influenced the detective genre he helped create. When Arthur Conan Doyle wrote the Sherlock Holmes stories, he acknowledged Poe as his precursor. The figure of the detective, logical, observant, relentless, emerged from Poe's Dupin. Yet Poe's own death remains resistant to detection. The case has no resolution. The detective story is left open. This inversion underscores the themes of failure and fallibility in his work. It suggests that even the greatest minds cannot solve every puzzle, that some mysteries remain. It also invites readers to become detectives. Many of us, after reading about Poe's final days, find ourselves scouring letters, comparing timelines, evaluating witness reliability. The experience of reading about his death thus mirrors the engagement of reading his detective stories. We are compelled to gather clues, weigh evidence, and propose solutions. And like the narrator in The Murders in the Rue Morgue, we realize that we may not be equipped to solve it. The unsolved death becomes a meta-commentary on the genre. Finally, the unresolved death fosters community. People gather annually at his grave. They host death tours in Baltimore, visiting the places he might have been. They read his poems aloud at midnight. They participate in online discussions, each offering their own theories. In a fragmented world, the mystery becomes a point of connection. We may disagree about cooping or cholera, but we share curiosity. We raise glasses in different cities and time zones, connected by the story. The open question invites ongoing dialogue. It ensures that his memory is not static but dynamic, growing as new voices join the conversation. In concluding this series, we return to the edge of a city street. The fog is thick again. We hear the faint tolling of a bell. In the distance, a figure in a wide-brimmed hat leaves 3 roses and a bottle. We do not follow him. We respect the anonymity. We stand with the crowd, our breath forming little clouds. We think of Poe's words, "Quoth the raven nevermore." The raven refused to provide answers. It repeated an enigmatic refrain. So does the story of his death. The absence of resolution is not a void, but a presence, a space filled with stories, tributes, and questions. It keeps us returning to his grave, to his books, to his life. It teaches us that sometimes mysteries endure, not because we have failed to solve them, but because they serve a purpose. They sustain memory, cultivate curiosity, and connect us across time. In this sense, Poe's unsolved death may be his final and perhaps greatest act of artistry. We end not with the solution, but with gratitude, for the questions he left us, for the stories he told, and for the community his life and death have formed. We extinguish the candle, we leave the fog, the echoes of the puzzle remain, whispering that there are some stories we are meant to continue telling, not to resolve. We have walked through cobblestone streets and candlelit rooms, across wharves and voting halls, through diaries and letters. We have held his cane in our hand, listened at tavern doors, sat at the foot of his sickbed, and watched him on a steamer deck. We have tried on the garments of every theory: Cooping, delirium, rabies, Parkinson's, and examined them for seams. We have weighed the testimonies of temperance advocates, cousins, doctors, scholars, and novelists. We have peered into the dark corners where facts become shadows, and now, having exhausted our questions, we are left in a small circle of light, with the man himself barely glimpsed. Edgar Allan Poe remains, as one scholar put it, a figure shrouded in opinion and contradiction, whose death must probably remain a mystery. The few tantalizing facts we possess lead us nowhere certain, and we must accept that perhaps this puzzle will never yield. Yet there is strange comfort in this uncertainty. Poe's death has become part of his identity. As visitors walk into his houses in Baltimore, Richmond, Philadelphia, and the Bronx, they almost always begin by asking how he died. Tour guides at his old cottage in the Bronx will tell you that the first question is not about Virginia or the Raven, but about his final days. The mystery is one of the great literary stage exits of all time, critic Mark Dawidziak writes, and it is a major factor keeping him alive as one of the world's most recognizable authors. His biography does not start, as most do, at his birth, but at his death. When we speak of him, we begin with the ending. We're drawn to the idea of a writer of tales who himself exits like a character in his own story, vanishing into fog, leaving behind a question mark. This echo between his art and his life deepens our fascination. It turns his death into a mirror in which his narratives of premature burials, spectral voices, and beating hearts are reflected back. The way we remember his death also reveals the way we remember his life. Once a year, before dawn on January 19th, the day of his birth, a figure dressed in black with a wide-brimmed hat and white scarf used to slip through the gates of Westminster Hall and Burying Ground in Baltimore. This person, known as the Poe Toaster, poured a glass of cognac or amontillado, raised a silent toast to Poe, and left 3 roses on his grave before vanishing into the shadows. The roses, some say, represent Poe, his wife Virginia, and his mother-in-law Maria Clem. The cognac might be a family tradition or a private joke. For decades, onlookers gathered to watch this ritual, never seeing the toaster's face. When the original toaster vanished in 1998, the tradition went quiet until it was revived in 2016. The ritual, like the man, is part performance, part devotion. It acknowledges that we cannot know everything. It turns the act of remembrance into an act of storytelling. To raise a glass in the dark is to admit the unknown, to toast not just a life but the enduring mystery around it. That such a ritual exists underscores the point. Our inability to resolve his final hours has, in some ways, amplified our connection to him. The toaster's anonymity mirrors the anonymity of the figure Poe called to from his hospital bed. The annual toast allows us to participate in the story. It gives us a role as respectful witnesses. This is perhaps the paradox of Edgar Allan Poe's legacy. The more we learn about his life, the more we feel the pull of what we cannot know. His writing invites us into liminal spaces, the moments before death, the threshold between dream and waking, the edges of sanity. His own death inhabits such a liminal space. In The Premature Burial, he wrote that the boundaries which separate life and death are shadowy and vague. His final days are similarly blurred. Was the man who called out Reynolds a victim of political violence? Was he gripped by delirium tremens? Was he whispering to a hallucination conjured by a degenerative disease? We will likely never know, and perhaps that is fitting. Because Poe's greatest gift was the ability to turn unresolved questions into art. He left gaps for readers to fill with their own imagination. The unsolved death functions as his final narrative device. It forces us to participate, to speculate, to wonder. At the same time, the unresolved nature of his death encourages us to reflect on our own relationship with uncertainty. In a world that often demands conclusions, Poe invites us to sit with ambiguity. His story shows that questions can be as enduring as answers, that curiosity can be a form of tribute. It teaches us that the unknown does not need to be tidily resolved to be meaningful. Our minds may long for closure, but our hearts often linger longer in spaces where a whisper remains unsaid. The mystery reminds us that life itself is full of unanswerable moments. Why someone leaves without goodbye, why a creative mind burns so brightly and so briefly, why we're drawn to darkness even when we seek light. Before we part, let us linger for a moment with a poem Poe wrote late in his life. In For Annie, he speaks of release. The danger is past, and the lingering illness is over at last, and the fever called living is conquered at last. Reading those lines now after wandering with him through his final days, we hear both relief and sorrow. We hear a man who longed for peace after years of suffering. We also hear the tension between living and dying, a tension that his unsolved death magnifies. In his letter to his mother-in-law, he wrote that he could barely hold the pen. In his letter to the world, he left us with a question we cannot answer. The fever of living is indeed conquered. The fever of curiosity burns on. Thank you for wandering with us. Thank you for stepping slowly through the fog and listening to the whispers of diaries, doctors, and detectives. Thank you for holding space for the unsolved. As we extinguish our candle, we leave you with the same silence that surrounds his grave. Perhaps the next time you see a raven or a slant of moonlight, you will think of the man who wrote of spirits and secrets, who believed that there are shadowy things in the world which cannot be explained. Perhaps you will feel the pull of his mysteries and offer your own quiet toast. His name drifts into the fog. It lingers on the air. We listen to the echo and let it fade.